An impassioned CEO invited his employee to sit at his table at the company party, and what she discovered changed their lives forever. A story of passion and destiny that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you are watching from. The banquet hall of the Grand Plaza in the heart of Silicon Valley had never hosted such a grand celebration. The golden lights of the crystal chandeliers danced over the guests, reflecting off the enormous glass panels that offered a panoramic view of San Francisco. The soft sound of a jazz quartet echoed among the lively conversations of the employees of Tech Global, the largest technology company in the country, celebrating another year of exponential growth. Sarah Johnson adjusted the black dress she had bought especially for the occasion, her nervous fingers smoothing the fabric as she observed the bustle around her. At 32, she was recognized as one of the most competent systems analysts in the company. But her understated appearance, brown hair always tied in a neat bun, thin-framed glasses, and an upright posture that betrayed years of self-discipline, made her go unnoticed at social events like this. "Sarah, you look stunning!" exclaimed Lisa, her best friend and co-worker, approaching with a glass of champagne in hand. Lisa was everything Sarah was not. Extroverted, spontaneous, with voluminous blonde hair and a smile that could win anyone over. Finally out of those work clothes, Sarah smiled shyly, her brown eyes scanning the environment. "You know I'm not really into parties, Lisa. I only came because it's mandatory." "Mandatory?" Lisa laughed, shaking her head. "Girl, you need to learn to relax. Just look at this place, this music. When was the last time you really had fun?" The question hung in the air because Sarah couldn't remember. Since moving from Springfield to San Francisco 5 years ago, her life had been reduced to codes, spreadsheets, and reports. She had grown up in a traditional family, where her father, a mechanic at a small garage, and her mother, a primary school teacher, instilled in her values like honesty, hard work, and the importance of financial independence. "I have fun working," Sarah replied, but her voice carried an uncertainty that did not go unnoticed by Lisa. "That's not fun. It's obsession," her friend retorted, but her expression softened. "Sarah, you're brilliant. Everyone knows that. But you're wasting your life. When was the last time you went out with someone? Dated?" Before Sarah could respond, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the hall caught her attention. The conversations quieted, as if an invisible conductor had signaled everyone to lower their voices. It was him. Raphael Montgomery walked through the hall with the confidence of someone born to lead. At 38, the CEO of Tech Global had a magnetic presence that seemed to alter the energy of the spaces he entered. Tall, around 6'1", with dark hair streaked with gray that gave him distinction, and blue-gray eyes that appeared to change color with the light. Raphael was the kind of man business magazines loved to feature on their covers. "The prince has arrived," Lisa murmured, but there was a hint of admiration in her voice that she tried to mask with sarcasm. Sarah watched Raphael greet the guests, noticing how he dedicated his full attention to each person he spoke to, as if nothing else in the world mattered at that moment. There was something hypnotic about the way he smiled, not a social smile, but something that seemed genuine, almost conspiratorial. "He's coming over here," Lisa whispered, gripping Sarah's arm. Sarah felt her heart race as she realized Raphael was indeed heading in her direction, his purposeful strides cutting through the crowd like a ship navigating calm waters. His scent, a sophisticated blend of sandalwood and bergamot, preceded him, enveloping her in a subtle cloud of masculinity. "Sarah Johnson," Raphael said, his deep velvety voice carrying a familiarity that surprised her. "We finally meet in person, Mr. Montgomery," she replied, extending her hand for a formal handshake. But he surprised her by kissing her hand gallantly, his lips barely brushing her skin, leaving a warmth that traveled up her arm. "Please call me Raphael," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Your reports on the management system optimization were brilliant. You have an extraordinary mind." Sarah felt her face flush. In 5 years at the company, this was the first time the CEO had spoken more than 5 words to her. Thank you, I just do my job. No, you do much more than that, Raphael smiled, and Sarah noticed a small, almost imperceptible scar at the corner of his mouth. You find solutions where others see only problems. That's a rare gift. Lisa cleared her throat beside them, clearly uncomfortable with the interaction. Well, I'm going to get more champagne, she said, casting a meaningful glance at Sarah before stepping away. Raphael barely seemed to notice Lisa's departure, his attention fully focused on Sarah. You know, I was thinking, have you ever dined at the Ivy? Sarah blinked, confused. The Ivy was one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in San Francisco, frequented only by the city's elite. No, I never. How about next Tuesday? Raphael gently interrupted. There's a special project I'd like to discuss with you. Something that might interest you. A project? Sarah tried to keep her voice steady, but his proximity was having a disturbing effect on her usual concentration. Raphael leaned in slightly, closing the distance between them. The jazz continued playing in the background, but for Sarah, the world had shrunk to that small space between them, where she could feel the warmth radiating from his body and notice every detail of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the expressive eyebrows, the way his eyes seemed to decipher her every thought. Take a seat at my table. Just the two of us, he said, his voice low and intimate, laden with a promise she couldn't decipher. There are things I need to discuss with you, Sarah. Important things. Sarah felt her breath become shallower. There was something in the way he pronounced her name, as if it were a precious word he savored, that made her stomach tighten in a mix of anxiety and anticipation. I'm not sure if that would be appropriate, she managed to say, her conservative upbringing clashing with her growing curiosity. Why wouldn't it be? David smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes, creating small wrinkles at the corners that made him even more attractive. We are colleagues, and I have a proposal that could change your career. There's nothing inappropriate about it. But there was something inappropriate, Sarah thought. It was the way her heart raced, how her hands trembled slightly, how her whole body seemed to awaken from a long slumber just by his proximity. It was the feeling that this conversation would change something fundamental in her life, even though she didn't know exactly what. Tuesday at 8. David continued, pulling a card from the inner pocket of his suit. The address is here. Don't worry about the reservation. Everything will be arranged. Sarah took the card, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The paper was thick, high quality, with the information embossed in gold lettering. See you Tuesday, Sarah, David said, kissing her hand again before stepping away, leaving her standing there, card in hand, and a feeling of vertigo that had nothing to do with the champagne she hadn't even drunk. Lisa appeared at her side seconds later, her eyes wide. Oh my God, Sarah, what just happened? David Anderson invited you to dinner. Sarah looked at the card in her hands, still sensing his scent in the air. He said it's about work. Work? Lisa laughed, but it wasn't a cheerful laugh. Sarah, you're so naive. Men like David Anderson don't invite system analysts to work dinners at the Ivy. What do you mean? Sarah asked, although a part of her already knew the answer. I mean, you just caught the attention of the most powerful and desirable man in Springfield, Lisa replied, her voice laden with an emotion Sarah couldn't fully identify. And this could be the best or the worst thing that ever happened to you. Sarah tucked the card into her bag, her heart still racing. As she watched David move through the room, greeting other guests with the same attention he had given her, a question echoed in her mind. Why her? Among all the women present, more beautiful, more sophisticated, more experienced, why had he chosen her? The answer would come on Tuesday, but Sarah already knew that no matter what David Anderson wanted to discuss, her life would never be the same. Topic 2. The dinner that revealed secrets. The Ivy stood majestically on Lorena Avenue, its vertical gardens and glass facade reflecting the golden lights of the Springfield sunset. Sarah paused outside the restaurant, watching the valet parkers receiving luxury cars with the ease of those who dealt daily with the city's elite. Her hands sweated inside the leather gloves she had bought especially for the occasion, along with a navy blue dress that consumed almost half of her monthly salary. "Miss Johnson?" An impeccably dressed maitre d' appeared at her side as if he had materialized from thin air. "Mr. Anderson is waiting for you at the reserved table." The interior of the restaurant took her breath away. The high ceiling, adorned with baccarat crystal chandeliers, created an atmosphere of a modern cathedral. The tables were strategically spread out to ensure absolute privacy for each couple, while musicians played discreetly on a grand piano positioned in the center of the room. The aroma of fine spices and aged wines lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle scent of white orchids adorning each table. David stood up when he saw her approaching, and Sarah noticed how he seemed even more imposing in that setting. He wore a tailored dark suit that accentuated his athletic silhouette, and his hair was slicked back, fully revealing his angular face. But it was his eyes that captured her. In the intimate light of the restaurant, they appeared more grey than blue, filled with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "Sarah, you look stunning," he said, pulling out a chair for her to sit. His fingers brushed her shoulders for a moment as he helped her settle in, and she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Thank you," she murmured, trying not to appear as impressed as she felt. The table was strategically positioned by the window, offering a panoramic view of the city that stretched to the horizon, where the last rays of sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I hope you enjoy French wine," David said, gesturing to the sommelier who approached with a bottle wrapped in a white cloth. "I brought a 1995 Bordeaux, an exceptional year." Sarah nodded, although her knowledge of wine was limited to the national labels she occasionally bought at the supermarket. She watched fascinated as David performed the tasting ceremony, the way he swirled the glass, inhaled the aroma, and savored the first sip with the concentration of an expert. "Perfect," he said to the sommelier, who served both of them with precise and silent movements. "David," Sarah began after they were alone, "you mentioned a special project." He smiled, resting his elbows on the table and intertwining his fingers. "Always getting straight to the point. It's one of the things I admire most about you, Sarah. In a time when everyone prefers to beat around the bush, you go straight to the heart of the matter. It's just that I don't usually frequent places like this," she admitted, discreetly gesturing to the luxurious surroundings. "I feel a bit out of my element." "And what is your element?" David asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Tell me about Sarah Johnson." "What I know about you comes only from HR reports and distant observation." Sarah hesitated, fiddling with the stem of her glass. "There's not much to tell. I was born in Springfield, the daughter of a mechanic and a teacher. I came to New York to study information systems at NYU, landed an internship at Tech Global in my last year, and was hired full-time after graduation. 5 years later, here I am." "Those are just facts," David said gently. "I want to know about you. Your dreams, your fears, what drives you to work until 2 in the morning when everyone else has gone home." The question caught her off guard. No one had ever shown real interest in getting to know her beyond her professional competence. I guess I've always been afraid of not being good enough. My parents made many sacrifices for me to study. My dad worked 16 hours a day at the shop, and my mum always came home with ink stains from the paper she graded late into the night. I can't waste the opportunities they gave me." David watched her in silence for a long moment, his eyes seeming to decipher every nuance of her expression. "And what do you want for yourself? Not for your parents, not to prove anything to anyone. What does Sarah Johnson desire for her own life?" The question left her speechless. It was unsettling to realize that at 32, she had never asked herself that question sincerely. There had always been something to prove, a professional goal to achieve, a target to surpass. "I don't know," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Then let me help you discover," David said, leaning slightly in her direction. "The project I mentioned, it's something revolutionary. We're developing a new division in the company focused on educational apps for low-income children. Cutting-edge technology with a social purpose. Sarah's eyes lit up for the first time that night. Education has always been close to my heart. My mom always said it was the only tool truly capable of changing a person's reality. Exactly. David smiled, and Sarah noticed how his expression transformed when he spoke about something he believed in. Imagine apps that teach math through games, that make reading an adventure, that connect children from underserved communities with the best educational opportunities in the country. That would be amazing, Sarah said, feeling an excitement she hadn't experienced in years. The possibilities are endless. Augmented reality to teach science, personalized artificial intelligence for each learning pace. You understand the vision perfectly, David said, his eyes shining. That's why I want you leading the development, Director of Educational Technology, with full authority to build your team and implement your ideas. Sarah nearly choked on her wine. Director, David, I'm just an analyst. You're much more than that, he interrupted, his voice filled with conviction. I've watched your work for years, Sarah. The way you've optimized our management system has saved the company millions. Your suggestions on user interface increased our satisfaction by 40%. You have a vision that goes beyond codes and algorithms. But I've never managed a team. Never. And I had never run a company when I took over Tech Global at 28. David said, extending his hand across the table and covering hers. The touch was firm, warm, and sent an electric current through Sarah's arm. Great leaders aren't born ready, Sarah. They're discovered in moments of opportunity. Sarah looked at their hands, intertwined on the table, his elegant and well-groomed, hers small and trembling. What would the salary be? As she asked, trying to keep the conversation in professional territory, although his physical proximity was causing a turmoil in her senses. 500,000 a year plus profit sharing, David said casually, as if he were talking about the weather. Sarah pulled her hand back abruptly, her eyes wide. That's 5 times what I currently earn, and yet it's still less than you're worth, David smiled. Sarah, I'm offering you the chance to transform your life, to become the woman you've always had the potential to be. The waiter appeared discreetly to serve the main course, a grilled salmon with a herb crust that looked like a work of art on the white porcelain. Sarah barely noticed the food, her mind spinning around the impossible proposal she had just received. Why me? She finally asked. There are people much more qualified in the company. Because you have something that can't be taught in any MBA, David said, delicately cutting his fish. You have integrity. In 5 years, I've never seen you make ethical compromises. I've never seen you bend to internal political pressures. And for what I'm planning, I need someone I can trust absolutely. And you trust me? Sarah asked, genuinely surprised. David stopped eating and looked directly at her. More than I trust most people I've known for much longer. There was something in the intensity of his gaze that made Sarah feel exposed, as if he could see directly into her soul. It was a feeling both terrifying and exhilarating. I need time to think, she finally said. Of course, David nodded, but don't take too long. The project needs to start in 6 weeks, and there's a lot to prepare. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the discreet clinking of cutlery against porcelain and the distant murmur of other conversations. Sarah tried to process everything she had heard, but her concentration was constantly interrupted by the magnetic presence of the man in front of her. Sarah, David said softly, putting down his cutlery. Can I ask you a personal question? She nodded, though her heart raced. Sarah's throat suddenly felt dry. Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life? Like you were following a script written by someone who doesn't even know you? The question hit her like a punch in the stomach. That was exactly how she felt most days, like she was playing the role of the obedient daughter, the exemplary employee, the successful woman, but never truly being herself. Every day, she admitted, her voice trembling. David leaned over the table, closing the distance between them even further. Then accept my proposal, Sarah, not for the promotion, not for the money. Accept it because it's time for you to discover who you really are. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, moved that someone finally saw through the facade she had so carefully built. "David, Don't answer me now," he said, discreetly signaling for the waiter to bring the check. "Think about what we talked about. And when you decide, trust your instincts, not your fears." As they left the restaurant, New York sparkled in all its nighttime glory. David walked her to the valet, where her car, a shiny black BMW, was already waiting. "Can I give you a ride home?" he offered. Sarah shook her head. "I think it's better if I take a cab," David nodded, understanding her need to process everything alone. "It was a special night, Sarah. Thank you for accepting my invitation." He leaned in and gently kissed her forehead, an intimate and paternal gesture that left her even more confused about his intentions. As he stepped back, Sarah could smell his cologne lingering on her skin. "See you later, Sarah," he said, getting into the car. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, watching the taillights of the BMW disappear into the traffic on the bustling streets. Her head was spinning with everything that had happened: the impossible proposal, the intimate conversation, the way he made her feel seen and understood. When she finally managed to get a cab, it was almost midnight. Throughout the ride to her apartment in Brooklyn, one question echoed in her mind. Had it been a business dinner or something much more? Dangerous? She knew the answer would change everything. Monday arrived with a tension Sarah had never experienced before. Sitting at her desk on the 15th floor of Tech Global, she gazed out the window at the mirrored buildings of Midtown while her hands trembled over the keyboard. She had spent the entire weekend replaying every word, every glance, every gesture from her dinner with David, trying to decipher if she had interpreted his intentions correctly. "You seem different," Lisa observed, approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her friend wore a vibrant red blazer that contrasted with her visibly altered mood. "How was that business dinner?" Sarah accepted the coffee, feeling the strong aroma mix with the floral perfume Lisa always wore. "It was enlightening." "Enlightening?" Lisa raised an impeccably arched eyebrow. "Sarah, you went to dinner with the most powerful man in the company on a Tuesday and come back on Monday saying it was enlightening." "I want details." "Lisa, it really was about work," Sarah sighed, though she knew she was being partially dishonest. "He offered me a promotion." "What kind of promotion?" Lisa's voice carried a mix of curiosity and something dangerously close to jealousy. Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. The screen displayed D. Anderson, CEO, and her heart raced immediately. "Sarah." David's deep voice echoed through the phone, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. "I hope you had a good weekend to reflect on our conversation." "Yes, Sarah noticed Lisa leaning in shamelessly to try to listen to the conversation and stepped back a few paces. "I have some questions about the project." "Perfect! How about we go up to my office now? There are some things I need to show you." David's office occupied the entire 30th floor of the building, an impressive space with glass walls offering a 360-degree view of the city. Sarah had only been there once, 2 years ago, during a general meeting with all the department heads. Now alone with him in an environment that exuded power and sophistication, she felt small and out of place. "Please have a seat," David said, gesturing to one of the Italian leather armchairs positioned in front of his solid mahogany desk. He had swapped his suit for a white linen shirt and dark trousers, a more casual look that made him less intimidating, but no less attractive. Sarah settled into the chair, noticing how the soft leather molded to her body. The office smelled of leather, freshly brewed coffee, and a subtle hint of the cologne she had already learned to associate with him. "Coffee, water." "I can have something brought in," David offered, but Sarah shook her head, eager to understand what she was really getting into. David moved his chair closer to hers, eliminating the formal barrier of the desk between them. "First, I want you to know that everything we discuss here will stay between us. Absolute confidentiality." "Of course," Sarah nodded, though a small part of her mind wondered why so much mystery for a corporate project. David stood up and walked to a discreet safe embedded in the wall behind his desk. He entered a complex code and retrieved a blue folder marked "Confidential" in red letters. "The Digital Education Project," he said, returning and placing the folder on the coffee table between them. "But this is just the tip of the iceberg, Sarah." She opened the folder and found herself facing detailed documents, financial spreadsheets and market studies. The numbers were impressive. Tech Global planned to invest $50 million in the first 2 years of the project. "David, this is much more ambitious than you mentioned on Tuesday," Sarah said, flipping through the documents. "You're talking about creating an entire subsidiary." "Exactly. And you would be the CTO of that subsidiary." David leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "There's something more you need to know before making your decision." Sarah lifted her gaze from the documents, noticing a subtle change in his expression. There was a seriousness there that hadn't existed during the romantic or professional dinner. She still wasn't sure. "Tech Global doesn't have the cleanest reputation in the market," David said, his voice low and heavy with weight. "In the last 5 years, under the previous board's management, some questionable decisions were made." "What kind of decisions?" Sarah asked, although part of her already feared the answer. David stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the frantic movement of the city below. "Anti-competitive practices. We bought patents from small companies for pennies on the dollar, using insider information about their financial struggles. There were cases of industrial espionage." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "Are you telling me that the company I've worked for the last 5 years is corrupt?" "It was," David corrected, turning to face her. "When I took over as CEO 3 years ago, I inherited many problems created by the previous board. I have been systematically working to clean our reputation, but some things from the past may still come to light." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "If it's true, you're admitting to corporate crimes." David sat back down, this time even closer to her. "Because I need someone with integrity by my side. Sarah, someone who can help me transform this company into what it should have been from the beginning." "David," Sarah began, but he gently raised his hand. "I know it's a lot to process. That's why I want you to have full access to the files, to talk to independent lawyers, to conduct your own investigation before deciding." Sarah looked again at the documents in her hand, now noticing details that had gone unnoticed in her first reading. The educational project wasn't just a business initiative, it was a form of corporate social responsibility, an attempt to repair damage done in the past. "The companies that were harmed," she said slowly, "one of them was called LearnTech Innovations." David nodded gravely. "Do you know them?" Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "My best friend's father from college was a co-founder of LearnTech. They lost everything when the company went bankrupt 3 years ago. Luciana never told me the details, but I know it was devastating for the family." The silence that followed was thick with tension. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that revealed his own restlessness. "Sarah, I didn't know about that connection," he finally said. "Does that change anything for you?" Sarah abruptly stood up, starting to pace the office. The panoramic view of the city that had once impressed her now felt like a cruel metaphor. She was on top, looking down at all the people who had been harmed by decisions made in that very place. "It changes everything," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "David, you're asking me to lead a project that is funded, at least in part, by money that should have gone to families like Luciana's. I'm asking you to help me do the right thing." David stood up as well, moving closer to her. "The educational project is our way of giving back to society what was taken. It's our chance to ensure that past mistakes don't happen again." Sarah stopped pacing and faced him. There was sincerity in his eyes, but also a vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. "How can I be sure you're not part of the problem?" "You can't," David admitted. "Not completely, but I can give you access to everything. Financial documents, meeting records, conversation recordings. You can hire your own auditors, talk to former employees, conduct whatever investigations you deem necessary. And if I find out you were involved in the questionable practices?" David looked her directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "Then you should report me to the authorities and look for another job." The answer surprised her. There was a brutal honesty there that completely disarmed her defenses. "David, why me? Why not hire someone from outside, someone with no connections to the company's past?" He stepped toward her, and Sarah could feel that unsettling magnetism he had over her once again. "Because I've watched you for years, Sarah. I've seen how you treat junior employees, how you refuse to engage in gossip, how you never take credit for other people's work. I've seen you working on Saturdays to help colleagues with projects that weren't even your responsibility." "That's just being professional," Sarah murmured, though her cheeks were flushing. "No, that's having character," David said softly. "And that's exactly what this company needs." Sarah sat back down, her mind spinning with all the implications of what she had discovered. The dream project had turned into a complex moral dilemma, and the professional proposal was dangerously intertwining with feelings she could barely name. "I need time," she finally said. "And I want to talk to Luciana before making any decision." "Of course," David nodded. "But Sarah, when you talk to her, remember that we have the chance to bring something positive out of a negative situation. We can't change the past, but we can influence the future." Sarah stood up to leave, but paused when David gently held her arm. "One last thing," he said, his voice low and intimate. "Everything we've discussed, this whole complex situation, it doesn't change the fact that you are an extraordinary woman, Sarah. And I would very much like to get to know you better, regardless of your professional decision." Sarah felt her heart race again. "David, that would be complicated." He smiled, and there was a sadness in that smile that touched her deeply. "The best things in life usually are." Sarah left the office with her mind in turmoil, carrying not only a folder of confidential documents, but also the weight of a decision that could change her life forever. And as she waited, as the elevator doors closed, a certainty crystallized in her mind. No matter what choice she made, she would never be the same person who had entered that office. The elevator doors shut, and Sarah found herself reflected in the polished metal, seeing a woman on the brink of a transformation she did not yet fully understand. The week that followed was a whirlwind of contradictory emotions for Sarah. She had taken the confidential documents home and spent her nights poring over them in her small apartment, surrounded by cold coffee cups and scribbled notepads. Her two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, with its walls adorned with plants and family photographs, had turned into an improvised investigation center. The doorbell rang on Thursday evening, interrupting her analysis of a particularly complex financial report. Sarah opened the door to find Emily Thompson standing in the hallway, her curly hair tied up in a messy ponytail, and her eyes red from recent tears. "Em?" Sarah opened the door wide, surprised by the unexpected visit from her college best friend. "What are you doing here?" "I thought you were in Springfield, taking care of your dad." Emily stepped inside without ceremony, her eyes immediately noticing the documents scattered across the coffee table. "Sarah, I need to talk to you." "It's about Tech Global." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Emily flopped onto the sofa, nervously running her hands through her hair. At 31, she maintained the same intense personality from their college days, but there was a maturity forged by adversity in her gestures. "My dad had another episode of depression last week. He was hospitalized, and while I was sorting out his paperwork for insurance, I found this." She pulled a yellowed folder from her bag and placed it on the table next to the Tech Global documents. Sarah felt a chill as she saw the faded logo of LearnTech Innovations on the cover. "I didn't know you still had documents from your dad's company." "Neither did I," Emily said, her voice heavy with pain. "He hid everything from me and my mom. He didn't want us to know the details of what happened." "But Sarah," she leaned forward, holding her friend's hands, "Tech Global didn't just take our contracts. They sabotaged our system." Sarah felt the blood run cold in her veins. "What do you mean, sabotaged?" Emily opened her father's folder and pulled out a series of printed emails, technical reports and contracts. "Look at this. 2 months before LearnTech went under, our main client, the state government, reported a series of failures in our educational management system. Failures that appeared out of nowhere after 2 years of functioning perfectly. Sarah took the documents, her systems analyst eyes immediately identifying the anomalies described in the reports. This looks like sabotage. Someone introduced malicious code into your system. Keep reading, Emily said, her voice trembling with contained anger. Sarah turned the page and found a series of emails exchanged between Tech Global employees, including some she recognized as colleagues still working at the company. The messages openly discuss strategies to neutralize LearnTech's competition and mention payments to an external consultant to resolve technical issues. "Oh my God," Sarah murmured, feeling nauseous. This is criminal. And there's more," Emily said, pulling another document from the folder. 3 weeks after we lost the contract with the government, Tech Global submitted a proposal to replace our system. A proposal that was almost identical to the project my dad had developed. Sarah studied the document, mentally comparing it to the systems she knew from Tech Global. The similarity was undeniable, not just in functionality, but even in technical architecture. They stole your project. They stole 3 years of my dad's work. Sarah, 3 years he spent sleeping 4 hours a night, investing all the family's savings, dreaming of creating something that would truly make a difference in public education. Emily stood up and began pacing the room, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Do you know what this did to him? He never recovered. Since then, he's been on antidepressants and blaming himself for the incompetence that led the company to bankruptcy. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. She had known Mr. Thompson since college, a kind and idealistic man who always spoke passionately about the transformative power of education. Imagining his suffering filled her with a rage she had never experienced before. Why are you showing me this now?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer. Emily stopped pacing and faced her friend. "Because I heard you're being promoted at Tech Global. Lisa told me you had dinner with the CEO and that there are rumors of a big promotion." Sarah sighed deeply. "It's more complicated than that." "Complicated how?" Emily sat down again, this time closer to Sarah. "Sarah, you're my best friend. If there's something I need to know..." Sarah looked at the documents spread across the table, the Tech Global ones on one side, the LearnTech ones on the other, like two conflicting versions of the same story. David Anderson offered me a director position to lead an educational technology project. David Anderson, Emily's eyes widened. Sarah, he was the vice president of Tech Global when my dad was sabotaged. His name appears in several of these emails. Sarah felt the world spin around her. She quickly grabbed Emily's documents and searched for the messages mentioning David. She found 3 emails where he was copied in discussions about competitive strategies and neutralizing market threats. "No, it can't be," Sarah murmured. "But the evidence was there, printed in black and white. He told me he inherited the problems from the previous board, that he was trying to clean up the company's reputation." "Sarah," Emily said gently, placing her hand on her friend's shoulder, "you're getting involved with a man who destroyed my father's life." Sarah abruptly stood up, starting to pace the room like Emily had moments before. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the charming and seemingly sincere man who had dined with her with the evidence of corporate corruption she had before her eyes. But what if he's telling the truth? What if the educational project is really a way to make amends for the past? With the money stolen from my father? Emily also stood up, her voice heavy with indignation. "Sarah, listen to what you're saying. You're defending a man who was part of the destruction of my family." "I'm not defending anyone!" Sarah exploded, her voice echoing off the apartment walls. "I'm trying to understand an impossible situation. Do you think it's easy to find out that the company I've worked for 5 years is corrupt? That the man who what, Sarah?" Emily asked, her expression shifting to concern. "What does this man mean to you?" Sarah stopped pacing, realizing she had revealed more than she intended. "Nothing. He means nothing. He's just my boss. Sarah Johnson, I've known you for 10 years, Emily said firmly, and I've never seen you like this over a boss. You're in love with him. The accusation hit Sarah like a slap. I'm not in love. I barely know him. Then why are your hands shaking? Why are you defending a man who has clear evidence of corruption against him? Emily stepped closer, her voice becoming gentler. Sarah, dear, you need to open your eyes. This man is manipulating you. Sarah threw herself onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. I don't know what to believe anymore. He seemed so sincere, so concerned about doing the right thing. Men like David Anderson don't get where they are by being sincere, Emily said, sitting next to her friend. They get there by being extremely good at convincing people they are who they are not. Sarah lifted her face, her eyes red from held-back tears. What if I'm wrong about him? What if I refuse the promotion and lose the chance to do something truly meaningful? And what if you accept and become complicit in more crimes? Emily countered. Sarah, you have a conscience. Use it. The two friends fell silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging over them like a heavy cloud. Sarah looked again at the documents spread out on the table, feeling as though she was watching her life shatter before her eyes. What do you want me to do, Em? She finally asked. I want you to report everything to the authorities, Emily said without hesitation. I want you to help my father get justice. And what if David really is innocent? What if he's being honest about trying to change the company? Emily took Sarah's hands and held them tightly. Then he will understand why you need to investigate before accepting the promotion. An upright man wouldn't be offended by a woman wanting to make sure she's doing the right thing. Sarah nodded slowly, knowing her friend was right, but feeling her heart shatter at the possibility of having been completely wrong about David. It's going to be hard, Sarah murmured. The right things usually are, Emily smiled sadly. But I'll be here to support you, no matter what you find out. Sarah hugged her friend, feeling a mix of gratitude and terror. She knew that on Monday she would have to confront David with the evidence Emily had brought. And depending on his answers, her life could change direction in a completely unexpected way. As Emily organized her father's documents, Sarah looked out the window at the city lights, wondering if David was out there somewhere, planning his next move in what now seemed to be a much more dangerous game than she had imagined. The night promised to be long, and Sarah knew she would need all her courage to face what was to come. Monday arrived shrouded in a cold mist that covered New York like a dark omen. Sarah arrived at the office 2 hours earlier than usual, carrying a folder with copies of the documents Emily had shown her. Her eyes showed signs of a sleepless night, and her hands trembled slightly as she prepared coffee in the empty break room on the 15th floor. The office was still silent, only the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant roar of morning traffic creating a soundtrack for her tumultuous thoughts. Sarah had mentally rehearsed the conversation she would have with David dozens of times over the weekend. But she still didn't know how to approach the subject without sounding accusatory or, worse, revealing how much this situation was personally affecting her. At 8:30, her phone rang. The screen displayed the name she had learned to associate with a disturbing mix of anticipation and anxiety. Good morning, Sarah. David's voice sounded particularly smooth through the phone. I hope you had a good weekend. Could you come up to my office? There are a few things I'd like to discuss. Actually, David, I also need to talk to you, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. It's about the project. And other things. Perfect. I'll be waiting for you. Sarah ended the call and took a deep breath, grabbing her folder and heading to the elevator. During the ride up to the 30th floor, she mentally reviewed the main points she needed to address. But when the doors opened and she saw David standing near the panoramic windows, watching the city wake up below, all her mental preparation seemed to unravel. He was dressed casually, dark jeans and a navy blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing tanned forearms. There was something different about his posture, a tension she hadn't noticed before. as if he too carried the weight of unspoken secrets. Sarah, he turned upon hearing her enter, and she noticed dark circles under his eyes. "Thank you for coming. Coffee?" "No, thank you," Sarah replied, sitting in the same leather armchair as the previous week, but this time holding the folder tightly in her hands. "David, before we talk about anything, I need to ask you some questions." David raised an eyebrow, but sat across from her without showing surprise. "Sure. I imagine your research on the company revealed some complications." "You could say that." Sarah opened the folder and pulled out the first documents. "David, you told me you inherited the company's ethical issues from the previous board. But according to these emails, you were at the company when some of these questionable practices occurred." She extended the copies of the emails that mentioned David, watching his reaction closely. To her surprise, he did not seem shocked or defensive. On the contrary, there was a resignation in his expression that caught her off guard. David took the documents and examined them carefully, his fingers tracing the lines of text as if they were old scars. "Sarah, where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" she replied, trying to maintain a professional tone. "David, your name appears in discussions about neutralizing the competition and strategies to eliminate market threats. How do you explain that?" David stood up and walked to the window, his hands buried in his pants pockets. The silence stretched for almost a minute, filled only by the muffled sound of traffic 30 floors below. "Do you know about LearnTech Innovations?" he finally asked without turning around. Sarah's heart raced. "I do." "Then you probably know they developed a revolutionary educational system that could have changed how children learn," David continued, his voice heavy with a sadness she did not expect. "And you know the company went bankrupt after losing an important contract with the state government." "I know that," Sarah said, her voice lower. "I also know that Tech Global took over that contract shortly after." David finally turned around, and Sarah was shocked to see tears glistening in his eyes. "Sarah, I was the vice president of technology at the time. I was 32 years old and desperate to prove my worth to the board. When they presented me with the plan to neutralize LearnTech, I should have refused. I should have reported everything." "But you didn't," Sarah said, trying to maintain objectivity even as her heart broke at the genuine pain in his eyes. "No, I didn't," David admitted, sitting back down. "I told myself it was just business, that this was how the market worked. I turned a blind eye to the details. I didn't ask questions about how exactly they planned to solve the competition problem." Sarah felt a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. On one hand, David was being honest about his involvement. On the other, he admitted to being complicit, even if passively, in the destruction of LearnTech. "David, do you know what this means?" she asked. "You are admitting to involvement in corporate sabotage, theft of intellectual property." "I know exactly what it means," David interrupted her, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "And that's why I live with it every day. That's why, when I became CEO, I vowed to myself that I would do everything in my power to make amends." "The educational project," Sarah murmured, beginning to understand. "It's much more than that." David leaned forward, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Sarah, for the past 3 years, I have been secretly compensating the companies that were harmed by Tech Global's practices. Consulting contracts, investments in their new ventures, even direct financial help for employees who lost their jobs." Sarah felt her perception of the situation shifting again. "Can you prove this?" David stood up and walked to the safe, typing the code with visibly trembling fingers. He pulled out an even thicker folder than the previous one and placed it on the table. "Bank transfers, contracts, correspondence with lawyers," he said. "All documented, all legal. But Sarah, there's one thing you need to know." She opened the folder and found documents confirming David's claims. There were significant transfers to various small companies, including some she recognized from the list of victims of Tech Global's anti-competitive practices. "Your friend Emily's father," David said softly. "His name is Eduardo Thompson, right?" Sarah's eyes shot up. "How do you know about Emily?" Because I've been trying to locate Mr. Thompson for 2 years, David replied. I want to offer him financial compensation and a formal apology. But he moved after LearnTech's bankruptcy, and I haven't been able to find him. Sarah felt as if she were on an emotional roller coaster. David, are you telling me you want to compensate Emily's father? I'm saying I need to compensate him, David corrected. Sarah, what we did to LearnTech was despicable. Eduardo Thompson was an honorable man trying to make a difference in education, and we destroyed him for corporate greed. We? Sarah asked. David stopped speaking, realizing what he had said. Sarah, what I allowed to happen. Sarah stood up and began to pace the office, trying to process all the conflicting information. David was guilty, but he was trying to redeem himself. He was complicit, but also a victim of a corrupt corporate system. He was the man who had destroyed her best friend's father's life, but also someone who genuinely seemed to care about making amends. David, she finally said, stopping in front of him. Even if all of this is true, even if you are trying to redeem yourself, there is still the fact that you hid your direct involvement from me. You told me you inherited the problems, not that you participated in them. You are right, David nodded. I should have been completely honest from the beginning. But Sarah, I was scared. Scared of what? David stood up and approached her, stopping just a few inches away. Scared that you would judge me for my mistakes. Sarah felt her breath quicken with his proximity. David, this isn't just about past mistakes. It's about trust. I know, he said softly, raising his hand as if to touch her face, but stopping mid-motion. And I know I don't have the right to ask for your trust after lying by omission. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. Why does this have to be so complicated? Because real life is complicated, David replied. Because people make mistakes and spend the rest of their lives trying to correct them. Because sometimes we meet the right people at the wrong time. David, Sarah began, but he gently interrupted her. Sarah, regardless of what you decide about the project, I want you to know that these last few days have been the first in years where I felt truly hopeful about the future. Not because of the company or the project, but because of you. Sarah felt her heart shatter. Don't make this harder than it already is. Then tell me, David said, his voice heavy with vulnerability. Tell me what I need to do to deserve a second chance. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw sincerity, regret, and something deeper that frightened her. I need to talk to Emily, she finally said. I need to tell her about your compensation proposal to her father. Do that, David nodded. And Sarah, if she wants to confront me in person, I will be available. It's time for me to face the consequences of my actions. Sarah nodded and headed for the door, but stopped before leaving. David, one last question. Anything. If I decide to accept the project, will it really be because you believe in my competence, or because you hope it will make me more accessible? David looked her directly in the eye, and she saw only honesty there. Sarah, if you accept the project, it will be because you are the most qualified and principled person I know to lead it. My feelings for you are completely separate from the professional proposal. Sarah nodded and left the office, knowing she had a very difficult conversation ahead with Emily. But for the first time since this whole situation began, she felt like she had all the pieces of the puzzle. Now she needed to decide what to do with them. The meeting with Emily was scheduled for the next day at Café Grumpy, a small establishment in the heart of Brooklyn that they had frequented since their college days. Sarah arrived first, choosing a table in the back where they could talk privately. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and artisanal pastries usually calmed her, but today it only intensified her anxiety. Emily arrived promptly at 3 in the afternoon, her eyes still red and puffy. She wore a grey sweater that made her look even paler, and Sarah noticed that she had visibly lost weight since the last time they saw each other. "How is your father?" Sarah asked, standing up to hug her friend. "Better, but still very fragile," Emily replied, sitting heavily in the wooden chair. "The doctor said the depressive episode was triggered by stress. Apparently, he's been thinking a lot about LearnTech lately." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. I need to tell you some things about my conversation with David. I hope you ended everything with him, Emily said, ordering a double coffee from the waitress who approached. Sarah, the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that you need to distance yourself from this situation. It's more complicated than that, Sarah sighed, nervously stirring the sugar. David admitted to being involved in what happened with your father's company. Emily's eyes widened. He admitted it? He said he was young and ambitious, that he should have opposed the board's plan, but didn't have the courage, Sarah explained. But there's more. He has been trying to compensate the affected companies for the last 3 years. Emily laughed bitterly. Compensate? Sarah, you can't be serious. He has documents proving bank transfers, consulting contracts, investments in new ventures of the companies that were sabotaged. Sarah pulled out some papers from her bag. And he's been trying to reach your father for 2 years to offer financial compensation. Emily took the documents with trembling hands, her eyes quickly scanning the numbers and dates. Sarah watched as her friend's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion, and then to something that looked like cautious hope. Sarah, these are significant amounts, Emily murmured. If this is true, it could help your father. Sarah gently completed. Emily placed the papers on the table and looked directly at Sarah. Why are you telling me this? I thought you decided to distance yourself from David Anderson. Sarah took a deep breath. It was the moment of truth. Because I can't shake the possibility that he is genuinely remorseful. And because I care about him, Sarah! Emily exclaimed, her voice heavy with concern. You are falling for the man who destroyed my family. I know how that sounds, Sarah said quickly. But what if he really has changed? What if this is our chance to get justice for your father, and at the same time ensure that something like this never happens again? Emily was silent for a long moment, absently stirring the coffee that had arrived. Sarah, even if David is sincere about wanting to redeem himself, how can we be sure he isn't manipulating you? We can't, Sarah admitted. But what if we are missing the chance to really make a difference? The educational project he proposed could impact thousands of children. With dirty money, Emily countered. With money that would be used to do something positive for the first time, Sarah replied. I'm not asking you to forgive. I'm asking you to consider that maybe there is a way that benefits everyone. Emily sighed deeply. What exactly are you proposing? That you agree to meet with David, that you hear personally what he has to say. If after Marina hesitated, if I still think it's manipulation, I refuse the promotion and we report everything to the authorities. What if I think he's sincere? Emily paused. Then maybe we can build something positive from the rubble of what was destroyed. Emily picked up her phone and looked at the screen for a moment before speaking. Marina, there's something I didn't tell you yesterday. What? My father attempted suicide 6 months ago, Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. He said he couldn't live with the shame of LearnTech Innovation's failure, that he felt he had failed all the children his system could have helped. Marina felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because it's very painful, Emily replied, wiping away a tear that rolled down her cheek. Marina, my father isn't just depressed. He's broken inside. And if David Anderson really wants to redeem himself, he needs to understand the extent of the damage he caused. He will understand, Marina said, reaching out to hold Emily's hand. Would you agree to meet with him? Emily nodded slowly. But with one condition. I want my father to be there too. Marina felt a pang of concern. Do you think he can handle it emotionally? I think he needs this, Emily replied. Marina, my father has been blaming himself for 3 years for something that wasn't his fault. Seeing David admit responsibility might be exactly what he needs to start healing. Marina nodded, picking up the phone. I'm calling David now. The call was answered on the 2nd ring. Marina, is everything okay? David, Emily agrees to meet with you. But she wants her father to be there too. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Of course, whenever and wherever they want. Tomorrow afternoon, at his office in San Jose, Marina said, looking at Emily, who nodded. David, are you sure you're ready for this? No, David replied honestly, but it's the right thing to do. After ending the call, Marina looked at Emily. It's done. Tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon. Marina, Emily said softly, no matter what happens tomorrow, thank you for not giving up on me, for trying to find a solution that works for everyone. We're friends, Em. That's what friends do. But when Marina returned home that night, a feeling of unease accompanied her. There was something in David's voice during the call, a hesitation she couldn't identify. And as she prepared for bed, a question echoed in her mind. What if David was hiding even more secrets? What if tomorrow's meeting revealed truths neither of them was prepared to face? She picked up the phone to call him, but hesitated. Tomorrow would be a day that changed everything for everyone involved. And Marina wasn't sure if she was ready for the consequences, whatever they might be. Outside her window, New York shone in the darkness, a city of millions, each carrying their own secrets and regrets. And somewhere out there, David Anderson was probably awake too, preparing to confront the ghost of his past mistakes. The night promised to be long for all of them. The trip to San Jose the next morning was tense and silent. Marina drove her silver Civic through the still congested highways, while Emily stared out the window, lost in thought. The sky was overcast, with heavy clouds threatening rain, creating a gloomy atmosphere that mirrored their mood. Are you sure your father is ready for this? Marina asked for the third time, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. As ready as anyone can be to confront the person who destroyed their life, Emily replied, her voice heavy with a mix of determination and anxiety. Marina, last night I told him everything. About David wanting to meet, about the compensations, about you. What did he say? Emily sighed deeply. That it was time to look into the eyes of the demon that's haunted him for 3 years. Marina felt a chill run down her spine. The way Mr. Thompson had expressed himself revealed the depth of his psychological suffering. And what if this is too much for him? What if the meeting worsens his depression? Or maybe it will free him, Emily replied, finally turning to look at Marina. My father's a strong man, Marina. He always has been. What broke him wasn't losing the company. It was not understanding why he lost it. It was blaming himself for incompetence that never existed. They arrived in San Jose shortly after noon. The Thompson house was in a quiet residential neighborhood with tree-lined streets and middle-class homes that breathed familial stability. Marina had been there several times during college and had always felt welcomed by the loving couple who treated their daughter's friends like their own daughters. Mrs. Thompson opened the door before they even rang the bell, as if she had been watching from the window. Mrs. Thompson was a petite, delicate woman with neatly styled grey hair and kind eyes that now bore the marks of years of worry. "Marina, dear," she exclaimed, embracing her warmly. "It's been so long. You look thinner. You need to eat better." "Hi, Mrs. Thompson." Marina smiled, feeling instantly younger in the presence of the woman who had always pampered her. "How is Mr. Edward?" Mrs. Thompson's expression darkened slightly. "Better than last week, but still very nervous about this meeting. He barely slept last night." They entered the house, which smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee. Marina noticed that little had changed since her student days. The same floral curtains, the same brown leather sofa, the same family photographs scattered across the tables. But there was a sadness in the air that hadn't existed before, as if the house also carried the weight of the past. A tragedy had struck the family. Edward Anderson was sitting in his usual armchair near the window that overlooked the small backyard garden. At 58, he had been a vigorous and energetic man, but Sarah was shocked by his current appearance. He had drastically lost weight, his hair was completely white, and there was a frailty in his movements that broke her heart. "Mr. Edward," Sarah approached and kissed his forehead, as she used to do when she was younger. "How are you?" Edward raised his eyes, and Sarah saw that they still sparkled with the intelligence she remembered, but there were deep shadows that hadn't existed before. "Sarah, my daughter, Emily told me about this complex situation you found yourself in. Dad, we have a few hours before David arrives," Emily said, sitting on the arm of her father's chair. "Do you want to talk about what you're going to say to him?" Edward shook his head slowly. "Daughter, I spent the whole night thinking about it. 3 years living with anger, with shame, with the feeling that I had failed. Now to discover that it wasn't my incompetence, but sabotage." He paused, running his trembling hands through his hair. "I don't know if I feel relief, or if I'm even more irritated." Mrs. Anderson approached and placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. "Edward, the important thing is that we now know the truth." "The truth," Edward repeated, as if the word was strange in his mouth. "Sarah, can I ask you a question?" "Of course, Mr. Edward. Do you believe that this man is sincere? That he truly regrets what he did?" Sarah hesitated. It was the question she had been asking herself for days, and she still didn't have a definitive answer. "I think so. But Mr. Edward, even if he is sincere, that doesn't erase what happened." "No," Edward agreed, "but perhaps it can give some meaning to the suffering." At exactly 3 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Sarah felt her heart race when she heard the familiar sound of a car engine shutting off in front of the house. Through the window, she saw David getting out of his BMW, dressed more casually than usual, dark jeans and a simple white shirt. There was a visible tension in his shoulders, and she noticed that he paused for a moment on the sidewalk, as if gathering courage. "I'll get it," Sarah said, standing up before anyone in the family could move. When she opened the door, David was standing with his hands in his pockets, his eyes revealing a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Sarah," he said softly, "thank you for arranging this." "David," she replied, stepping aside for him to enter. "They are in the living room." David nodded and walked in, his footsteps echoing on the ceramic floor. When they reached the living room, Sarah observed Edward's reaction upon seeing the man who had been responsible for the destruction of his dreams. Mr. Anderson slowly rose, leaning on the arm of the chair, and stood still, studying David with eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. "Mr. Anderson," David said, his voice heavy with emotion, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Edward did not respond immediately. He walked until he was a few feet away from David, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air like a physical force. "You are younger than I imagined," Edward finally said. "When I found out that someone had sabotaged my company, I pictured an older man, more cruel in appearance." "Mr. Anderson," David began, but Edward raised his hand. "Let me finish," the older man said, with a dignity that made Sarah feel a lump in her throat. "Do you know what the last 3 years have been for me?" "For my family?" David shook his head. "Not completely, but I imagine that—" "You have no idea," Edward interrupted him, his voice gaining strength. "You have no idea what it is to wake up every day, feeling that you disappointed not only your family, but thousands of children who could have benefited from the system I developed. You have no idea what it's like to question every decision you made, every line of code you wrote, searching for the mistake that caused the company's bankruptcy." David visibly paled. "Mr. Anderson, you have no idea," Edward continued, tears beginning to run down his face, "what it's like to try to take your own life because you can't live with the shame of a failure that wasn't even yours." Sarah saw David stagger, as if he had taken a physical blow. Mrs. Anderson sobbed quietly, and Emily moved closer to her father, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "My God," David murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "Mr. Anderson, I didn't know. I had no idea that your actions had real consequences in the lives of real people." Edward asked, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "That behind every competitive strategy there are entire families whose lives are destroyed." David stepped closer slowly, his own tears beginning to fall. "Mr. Anderson, there is nothing I can say that justifies what I did. There is no excuse for the cowardice I showed by not opposing the board's plan. But I want you to know that not a day goes by without me regretting not having had the courage to do the right thing." Edward studied him in silence for a long moment. "Do you have children, Mr. Anderson?" "No," David replied. "Then you cannot fully understand what it means to know that your actions deprived other children of opportunities that your own child could have had." Edward paused, taking a deep breath. "But I can see in your eyes that you carry that weight. And that tells me something about who you have become." David looked directly at Edward. "Mr. Anderson, I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am willing to do everything in my power to repair the damage I caused." "How?" Edward asked simply. David took a deep breath. "Financial compensation, of course. But more than that, I want to offer you—" Marina felt a rush of excitement at the opportunity to lead the new educational project at Tech Global. "I want your dream of revolutionizing education in Brazil to become a reality." Edward blinked, surprised. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Learn Tech innovations can rise again, this time with all the financial and technological support needed to make the difference you've always wanted to make," David explained. "And I'm saying that I want you as a partner, not as an employee." Marina felt her heart race. David hadn't mentioned this possibility before. She looked at Emily, who seemed equally surprised. Edward sat heavily in his chair, processing the proposal. "And you, Marina? What would your role be in all of this?" Marina looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Edward, David offered me the position of CTO for the project. But now I think it would be more appropriate for us to work together. You with the educational vision, and I with the technical implementation." "And me?" Emily suddenly asked. "I want to be part of this too. I want to help turn our family's pain into something positive." David looked at the three people in front of him, the man he had wronged, the daughter who had suffered the consequences, and the woman he had fallen in love with. "If you agree to work with me, it will be the chance I need to prove that I've truly changed." Edward remained silent for several minutes, looking out the window at the garden where he had planted rose bushes years ago. Finally, he turned to David. "Mr. Anderson, I will accept your proposal. Not because I forgive you. Forgiveness is something that needs to be earned over time. But because I believe that my educational system can truly make a difference in the lives of Brazilian children. And if you're offering the resources to make this a reality, then it's my duty to accept." David nodded, visibly moved. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I promise you won't regret it." "I'll make sure of that," Edward replied with a small smile, the first Marina had seen from him in years. When Marina left the Thompson house that afternoon, she carried with her more than just a new job. She carried the hope that perhaps sometimes the mistakes of the past could be transformed into opportunities for a better future. But as she drove back to New York, one question continued to haunt her. Had David really changed, or was she being drawn into an even more sophisticated manipulation than she had imagined? 2 weeks after the meeting in San Jose, Marina's life had completely transformed. She now occupied an office on the 28th floor of Tech Global, a modern space with a view of the city and a sign on the door that read, "Marina Johnson, CTO, Digital Education Project." The environment smelled of fresh paint and new furniture, tangible symbols of a fresh start that still felt surreal. Mr. Edward had temporarily moved to New York, occupying a corporate apartment near the office, and Marina was impressed by the transformation of the man. Each day spent working on the project that had been her dream for years seemed to restore a bit of the vitality he had lost. His eyes sparkled again when he spoke about personalized learning algorithms and intuitive interfaces for children. Emily had also agreed to join the team as the educational content coordinator, bringing her experience in educational psychology. The office had become a vibrant environment of creativity and purpose, but Marina couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was Thursday night, and she was working alone in the office, reviewing programming codes under the soft light of her desk lamp. The city stretched out below, a tapestry of lights that usually calmed her, but today only intensified her unease. "Working late again?" David's voice made her look up from her computer screen. He stood in the doorway, wearing a dark suit that looked like it had come straight from an important meeting, but there was a tension in his posture that she had learned to recognize. "The gamification system is almost ready," Marina replied, saving her work. "I think Mr. Edward will be impressed with the progress." David entered the office and closed the door behind him, a gesture that immediately put Marina on alert. "Marina, I need to talk to you. It's about the project, and about us." "Us?" Marina raised an eyebrow, though her heart involuntarily raced. David approached her desk but didn't sit down. Instead, he began to pace the office, his hands buried in his pants pockets. "Marina, these last few weeks have been special. Watching you work, seeing Mr. Edwards' enthusiasm, watching the project come to life. It reminded me of why I got into technology." "David, where are you going with this?" Marina asked, noticing that he was avoiding her gaze. He stopped pacing and finally looked her in the eye. "Marina, there's something I need to tell you. About the previous board, about how they were removed, about how I took full control of the company." Marina felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath and sat in the chair across from her desk. "The previous board members, they didn't leave the company voluntarily." "What do you mean?" Marina asked, though part of her already feared the answer. "They were blackmailing me," David said, his voice low and tense. "Marina, 3 years ago, when I started implementing ethical changes in the company, when I began compensating the harmed companies, they found out and threatened to expose me as an accomplice to all the questionable practices." Marina felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "David, are you telling me you were blackmailed?" "For 2 years," David nodded, running his hands through his hair. "They had recordings of meetings, compromising emails, documents that connected me directly to anti-competitive practices. They threatened to leak everything to the press if I continued trying to clean up the company." "My God," Marina murmured. "And you gave in to the blackmail?" "At first, yes," David admitted, his voice trembling. David looked loaded with shame. "I continued to allow some questionable practices while secretly trying to repair the damage of the past. I was living a double life, Sarah. By day, I turned a blind eye to minor corruptions. By night, I was transferring money to affected companies." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, trying to process what she was hearing. "David, how did you get rid of the blackmail?" There was a pause that lasted too long, and when Sarah turned around, she saw David staring at his hands. "Sarah, I found evidence that they were siphoning money from the company into personal accounts." "Evidence? Or did you fabricate it?" Sarah asked, her voice colder than she intended. David looked up sharply. "No!" "Sarah, I would never do that. I hired a private investigator, a former federal agent named Robert Smith. He discovered that they had been embezzling funds for years. And then I confronted them with the evidence. I told them that if they didn't resign voluntarily, I would report them to the federal authorities," David explained. "They left the company within 48 hours. Sarah sat back down, her mind racing. "David, do you have that evidence?" "I do," he replied, pulling a USB drive from the inner pocket of his blazer. "Everything is here. Bank transfers, correspondence, recordings of phone conversations." Sarah took the USB drive, feeling its insignificant weight in contrast to the magnitude of the information it contained. "Why are you telling me this now?" David leaned forward, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Because Robert Smith contacted me yesterday. The former board members are planning to retaliate. They found out about our educational project, about Mr. Edward, about you." "What do you mean?" Sarah felt her blood run cold. "They are investigating you, Sarah, your personal life, your family, looking for ways to pressure you into sabotaging the project or providing compromising information about me," David explained, his voice heavy with urgency. "Robert intercepted some communications. They know about your friendship with Emily, about the connection with Learn Tech Innovations." Sarah abruptly stood up, starting to pace the office. David, are you telling me I'm in danger because of your personal war with former colleagues? Sarah, I never wanted to involve you in this. David also stood up, trying to approach, but she stepped back. When I offered you the project, I didn't know they were capable of this. Capable of what exactly? Sarah asked, her voice laced with fear and anger. David hesitated again, and Sarah knew there were more secrets. David, tell me everything now. One of the former board members, Victor Carter, has connections to dangerous people, businessmen who don't hesitate to use intimidation tactics to solve problems, David explained. Robert believes they might try to blackmail you or threaten your family to force you to collaborate against me. Sarah felt as if she were in a nightmare. David, you put me in a risky situation without warning me. I didn't know, David exclaimed. Sarah, I never imagined they would go this far. I thought after 2 years they would have moved on. Moved on? Sarah laughed bitterly. David, you destroyed their careers. What did you expect? David stepped closer again, and this time Sarah didn't back away. Sarah, I understand your anger, but I need you to know that I will protect you. Robert is already implementing security measures. What kind of measures? Discreet security for you and your family. Monitoring your communications to detect attempts at contact and... He hesitated again. And what, David? And it might be best for you to temporarily distance yourself from the project. Go to a safe place until we resolve this. Sarah looked at him incredulously. You're asking me to run away? To abandon Mr. Edward and Emily when they need me the most? I'm asking you to protect yourself, David said, gently holding her shoulders. Sarah, I can't bear the thought of something happening to you because of me. Sarah pulled away from his hands. David, I need time to process all of this. I need to talk to Emily, to Mr. Edward. Sarah, please don't tell them yet, David interrupted. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with. More secrets, David? Sarah asked, her voice filled with disappointment. How many more are you still hiding from me? David looked her directly in the eye. None. Sarah, I know I made mistakes by not being completely transparent from the start, but everything I did was to try to protect you. Protect me or protect yourself? Sarah asked, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. Sarah, wait. David followed her. Where are you going? Home. I need to think, she replied, stopping at the door. David, when I decided to accept this project, it was because I believed you had changed. Now I find out you're still involved in dangerous corporate games. Sarah, I have changed. Everything I'm doing now is trying to correct past mistakes, David said, his voice filled with desperation. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, seeing vulnerability and sincerity in his eyes, but also recognizing that there were layers of complexity in that man that she still didn't fully understand. David, I need guarantees that Emily and Mr. Edward are safe. If anything happens to them because of this situation, I will never forgive myself, she finally said. They will be safe. I promise, David replied. Sarah nodded and left the office, but as the elevator doors closed, a certainty crystallized in her mind. No matter how much she cared for David, she could no longer allow him to make decisions about her life without her involvement. It was time to take control of the situation, even if it meant confronting dangers she still didn't fully understand. As the elevator descended to the ground floor, Sarah was already formulating a plan. First, she would speak with Robert Smith in person. Then she would take her own protective measures. And then she would decide if David Anderson truly deserved a second chance, or if he was just a dangerously skilled man at making people believe his version of the truth. The war that David had started years ago was far from over, and Sarah had just become a key player in it. The game. But this time she would play by her own rules. Monday arrived, charged with palpable tension in the office of the Educational Project. Sarah had spent the weekend investigating on her own, using her skills as a systems analyst to track down information about the former board members of Tech Global. What she discovered left her even more unsettled about the entire situation. Robert Smith arrived at the office at 9 o'clock sharp, a serious-looking man, around 45 years old, with greying hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the environment. He wore a discreet suit and carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days. Sarah welcomed him into the conference room, noticing how he discreetly checked the windows and exits before sitting down. "Miss Johnson," Robert said, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years dealing with dangerous situations. "Mr. Anderson asked me to keep you informed about the situation. I need you to understand the seriousness of what we are facing." "Mr. Smith," Sarah replied, placing some documents she had printed during her weekend research on the table. "Before we talk about the threats, I need to clarify a few things about David himself." Robert raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "What kind of things?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I spent the weekend investigating the timeline of events that David told me about, and there are significant discrepancies." "What kind of discrepancies?" Robert leaned forward, his attention fully focused on Sarah. "David said he was blackmailed by the former board members for 2 years, correct?" Sarah opened the first document. "But according to public records from the Secretary of State, the changes in the company's share structure began 3 years ago, not 2. Robert fell silent, studying the papers Sarah had prepared. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "I found records of bank transfers suggesting that David started consolidating power in the company long before he supposedly discovered the evidence of corruption against the board." "Miss Johnson," Robert said slowly, "what exactly are you suggesting?" Sarah looked directly into the investigator's eyes. "I'm suggesting that perhaps David wasn't a victim of blackmail. Maybe he orchestrated the entire situation to remove the board and take full control of the company." Robert leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of what Sarah had uncovered. "Miss Johnson, that's a very serious accusation. Mr. Anderson hired me to protect you, and there are apparently indications that the former board members pose a real threat." "Oh, yes, the evidence," Sarah said, pulling out another set of documents from her briefcase. "Mr. Smith, did you independently verify the evidence that David provided?" Robert hesitated. "Mr. Anderson showed me some documents, but I assumed they were authentic given the context." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "Mr. Smith, I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there really a threat against me, or is this part of a more elaborate manipulation?" Robert remained silent for a long moment, and Sarah could see the internal conflict reflected in his expression. Finally he sighed deeply. "Miss Johnson, I have 15 years of experience as an investigator, and something about this situation has never felt completely right," he admitted. "The supposed threats are very convenient, very well timed." "What do you mean?" "I mean, they appeared just when Mr. Anderson needed a reason to keep you close and dependent on his protection," Robert explained. "And the surveillance methods we implemented are more sophisticated than would be necessary for a typical corporate threat." Sarah felt as if a fog was lifting from her mind. "Mr. Smith, do you think David made everything up?" "Not completely," Robert said carefully. "I believe there are real tensions with the former board members, but the extent of the supposed threat against you, that may have been exaggerated." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, watching the movement of the city below. Her mind was racing, replaying all the conversations she had had with David, all the moments when he had seemed vulnerable and sincere. "Mr. Smith," she said without turning around, "I need a favor." "What?" "I need you to investigate David Anderson with the same diligence you would use to investigate any suspect." Sarah turned to face the investigator. "I want to know everything about him. His financial history, his personal relationships, his real motivations for everything he has done." Robert nodded slowly. "Miss Johnson, that means I will be investigating my own client. It could be complicated." "It may be necessary," Sarah replied. "And Mr. Smith, there's one more thing. I want you to keep this between us until we have all the information." "And Mr. Anderson?" Sarah took a deep breath. "David cannot know that we are investigating. At least not yet." Robert gathered his documents and stood up. "Miss Johnson, may I ask why you decided to investigate on your own? What made you suspicious?" Sarah hesitated, remembering all the moments when she felt something was off, all the instincts she had ignored because she wanted to believe in the romantic version of the story that David had painted. "Because I fell in love with him," she finally said. "And when we fall in love, sometimes we stop seeing things clearly. But my responsibility to Mr. Edward and Emily is greater than my personal feelings." Robert nodded respectfully. "I understand. Miss Johnson, I will investigate everything discreetly. But I need you to know that if my suspicions are correct, you may be dealing with someone much more dangerous than we imagined." "Dangerous? How?" "A man capable of manipulating situations and people with surgical precision," Robert explained. "Someone who may have orchestrated this entire situation, including your involvement, from the very beginning." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean by including my involvement?" Robert paused at the door and turned to her. "Miss Johnson, have you ever wondered why David specifically chose you for this project? Among all the systems analysts, talented individuals I could have hired, why exactly you?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had always questioned this, but had accepted David's explanations about his competence and integrity. "Mr. Smith," she said slowly, "do you think David knew about my connection with Emily from the beginning?" "That's what I'm going to find out," Robert replied. "But Ms. Johnson, if this hypothesis is confirmed, it means that everything, the dinner, the job offer, even the meeting with Mr. Edward, may have been carefully planned." After Robert left, Sarah was alone in the conference room, trying to process the implications of everything she had discovered. If Robert was right, then she was not just a pawn in David's game. She was the central piece, carefully positioned and manipulated to serve purposes she still did not fully understand. At that moment, her phone rang. It was David. "Sarah, good morning. How are you feeling after our conversation on Thursday?" Sarah looked at the phone, hearing the voice of the man she had fallen for, but now questioning every word, every inflection. "I'm fine, David, just processing everything." "I understand. Sarah, how about we have lunch today? There are some things about the project I'd like to discuss." Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to confront him immediately with her findings, but the more rational part knew she needed more information before making any move. "Sure," she finally said. "How about the Japanese restaurant in Little Tokyo? At 1 o'clock? Perfect. And Sarah, thank you for not giving up on me." After hanging up, Sarah looked out the window at the city stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there was the truth about David Anderson, and she was determined to find it, no matter how painful it might be, to discover that she may have never truly known the man she had fallen for. Today's lunch would be more than just a meal. It would be a test, and Sarah was ready to ask the right questions, even if the answers could completely destroy the image she had of David. As she prepared to leave, one last question echoed in her mind. If everything had been manipulation from the start, what did David really want from her? And more importantly, was she ready to uncover the truth, no matter how devastating it might be? Time would tell, but Sarah knew she could no longer postpone the confrontation. It was time to find out who David Anderson really was. The Japanese restaurant in Little Tokyo was busy for Monday lunch, the murmur of conversations in English and Japanese creating a familiar soundtrack for Sarah as she waited for David to arrive. She had chosen a table in the back, away from curious ears, and was mentally reviewing the questions she needed to ask. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred the green tea she had ordered. David arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, and Sarah noticed he seemed different. There was a tension in his shoulders that he couldn't disguise, and his eyes showed signs of a restless night. He wore a sharp grey suit, but there was something in his posture that suggested a man carrying an invisible weight. "Sarah," he said, kissing her forehead before sitting down, a gesture that once made her feel protected, but now left her uneasy. "You look beautiful, but you seem worried." "I have reasons to be," Sarah replied straightforwardly, deciding there was no time for pleasantries. "David, I need you to be completely honest with me about a few things. David raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Of course, what do you want to know? Sarah took a deep breath and pulled a folder from her bag, placing it on the table between them. I want to know exactly when you discovered my connection with Emily and LearnTech Innovations. David's expression changed subtly, a flash of surprise that he tried to mask, but Sarah caught clearly. Sarah, I told you. I found out when you mentioned it during our first conversation about the project. David, Sarah opened the folder and pulled out some documents. These are HR records from Tech Global. Here is my employee file, filled out 5 years ago when I was hired. David looked at the papers without picking them up. What does this have to do with... In the emergency contacts section, Sarah interrupted, pointing to a specific line. Emily Thompson's name is listed, along with her phone number and address. And here, in the personal references section, is Edward Thompson, identified as father of the best friend. David went completely still, his eyes fixed on the documents. David, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, you had access to this information since the day they hired me. You knew about my connection to LearnTech Innovations 5 years ago. The silence stretched for almost a full minute. Sarah watched David process the revelation that his lies had been discovered, seeing different emotions pass across his face. Surprise, calculation, and finally, an almost relieved resignation. Sarah, he finally said, his voice low. Yes, I knew. Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach, even knowing that this confirmation would come. Since when? Since I became CEO and started reviewing the files of all employees, David admitted. When I saw your connection to LearnTech, I began to observe you more closely. I wanted to understand what kind of person you were. Observe? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with contained anger. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she had learned to associate with moments of vulnerability, but now saw as possible manipulation. Sarah, I know how this looks, but it wasn't what you think. Then explain exactly what it was, Sarah said, leaning forward. Explain why you watched me for 5 years before approaching me. Explain why you made up the story about discovering my connection to LearnTech only recently. David looked around the restaurant, as if checking if anyone was listening, before leaning in towards her. Sarah. Because I was trying to find a way to make amends for what we did to the Anderson family without coming off as calculating or opportunistic. Trying to find a way? Sarah repeated. David, you manipulated me for years! No! David replied vehemently, but immediately lowered his voice. Sarah, I never manipulated you. I observed, yes. I wanted to understand who you were, how you thought, if I could trust you. But everything that happened between us was genuine. Sarah laughed bitterly. Genuine? David, you orchestrated our first meeting knowing exactly how I would react. You offered me a project that you knew I couldn't refuse, knowing that it would lead me to Mr. Edward. Sarah, listen. David tried to hold her hand, but she quickly pulled it away. No, David, now you will listen to me, Sarah said, her voice laden with a determination she didn't know she possessed. I spent the weekend investigating you. I spoke with Robert Smith this morning. I know about the discrepancies in the timeline of events with the previous board. I know about the bank transfers that suggest you planned your rise to power long before supposedly uncovering evidence against them. David visibly paled. Sarah, and I know, Sarah continued, pulling out more documents from the folder. About Sarah Johnson. David froze completely upon hearing the full name, including the surname that Sarah never used professionally. Sarah Johnson, she repeated, daughter of Edward Johnson and Emily Thompson. Born in San Jose in 1992, but registered as the daughter of Joseph and Rita Johnson of Springfield after the death of her biological parents in a car accident. Tears began to stream down Sarah's face as she spoke. David, you knew I was adopted. You knew my biological father was Edward Johnson, one of the original founders of Tech Global. You knew my connection to this company went far beyond just being an employee. David closed his eyes, as if feeling physical pain. "Sarah, please." "You knew," Sarah continued, her voice breaking, "that the man who created the original systems of this company, who established the ethical values you claim to be trying to restore, was my biological father. And you used that to manipulate me." David opened his eyes, and Sarah saw tears shining in them. "Sarah, you are right about everything, but you are wrong about one fundamental thing." "What?" "I fell in love with you," David said, his voice heavy with raw emotion. "Sarah, it may have started as strategy, but it turned into something real. You made me want to truly be the man I was pretending to be." Sarah stared at him through her own tears. "How can I believe anything you say now?" David pulled something from the inner pocket of his jacket, a yellowed envelope that looked decades old. "Because I have something that belongs to you." Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Noticing it was addressed to "Sarah, my daughter," in the elegant handwriting she recognized from old photographs. "It's a letter from your biological father," David explained. "He wrote it shortly before he died, asking for it to be delivered to you when you turned 30. It was in the personal files of the founders." Sarah carefully opened the envelope, pulling out several handwritten sheets of paper. Her hands trembled as she read the words of love and guidance from a father she barely knew. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you are already a strong and independent woman. I hope you have found your way in life and that you have used your talents to make a difference in the world." Sarah stopped reading, the tears blurring the words. "David, why did you keep this?" "Because when I discovered your true identity, I understood that you were so much more than an employee or a tool for my plans," David replied. "You were the daughter of the man I admired most in the history of this company. And I realized that perhaps fate had brought us together so I could correct not only the mistakes of the past, but also honor your father's legacy." Sarah looked at David through her tears, seeing sincerity and vulnerability that were impossible to fake. "David, even if your feelings are genuine, you lied to me for too long. How can I trust you again?" David leaned over the table, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Because I will spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve your trust." "Sarah, hand over the control of Tech Global to you." "What?" Sarah blinked, surprised. "Your father was one of the original founders. Legally, you are entitled to stock ownership," David explained. "Sarah, I want you to take over as CEO. I want to work for you under your ethical leadership. I want the company to become what your father dreamed it could be." Sarah remained silent for a long moment, processing the impossible offer. "David, this is a lot. It's what you deserve," David said, "and it's what the company needs. Someone with your father's integrity and the competence you have shown." Sarah looked again at the letter from her biological father, then at David, and finally at the document spread across the table. Evidence of lies, but also of regret and attempts at redemption. "David," she finally said, "if we are going to try to rebuild something real between us, it has to be based on absolute truth. No secrets, no manipulations, no games." "No secrets," David agreed.
"Sarah, will you give me one last chance?"
Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the decisions she had made in the past months, trusting David, questioning that trust, uncovering painful truths, and now facing the possibility of forgiveness and a new beginning. "I accept," she finally said, "but with conditions. First, total transparency about everything, past, present, and future. Second, Mr. Edward becomes an equal partner in the educational project, not just an employee. And third, David asked. Sarah smiled for the first time that day, a smile wet with tears but genuine. "Third, if you ask me to marry you again, you will have to—" David laughed, the first genuine laugh that Sarah had heard from him in weeks. "Sarah Johnson, did you just accept my marriage proposal?" "I just accepted to consider it," Sarah corrected. "When you prove that you deserve it." 6 months later, Sarah was standing at the same table at the Ivy, where it had all begun, but now as the CEO of Tech Global and engaged to David Anderson. The educational project had become a national success, positively impacting the lives of over 100,000 children in the United States. Mr. Edward had fully regained his confidence and vitality, leading a team of 20 developers. Emily was managing the educational content department, bringing her psychology expertise to create programs that truly made a difference. And David had kept his promise of total transparency, working tirelessly to prove that he deserved the second chance that Sarah had given him. When he knelt that Friday night, with a ring that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, discovered among the personal belongings of her biological father, and officially asked for her hand, Sarah knew she had found not only true love, but also her purpose. "Sarah Johnson," David said, his eyes shining with tears of happiness, "will you marry me, and let's build together the future that your father dreamed for this company and for America?" Sarah looked around the restaurant where her life had changed forever. Thought of Mr. Edward laughing again, of Emily thriving professionally, and of the children whose lives were being transformed by the educational technology they had developed together. "Yes," she said, "I accept." And as David placed the ring on her finger, Sarah knew that sometimes second chances truly lead to the happiest endings, especially when they are built on a solid foundation of truth, forgiveness, and genuine love. The soft sound of jazz filled the air once again, but now it was not the soundtrack of a mysterious invitation, but rather the celebration of a new beginning built on solid foundations of trust, shared purpose, and the certainty that the best was yet to come.